happy to say that we see these strategic interventions as a follow-up to what I had introduced last year, evaluating where we're at. We have inherited problems and we have emerging problems. And at all steps, even though sometimes we really do feel to take some, harsh action and we get angry and we get frustrated and we get tired, we must at all points be strategic. And that's something that we learned in a most profound way due to COVID-19. Because we realize that decisions about who gets funding, who gets support, who gets consideration as essential or not essential, how we imagine who is valid for business continuity, how we imagine who is valid for assistance, who's seen as legitimate citizens or not, is based on your strategic location. So to wrap up, excuse me. So to wrap up my point, I wanted to show you pictures and show you things, but to wrap up the point, what we have done is in multiple areas, from research projects, both with international and regional bodies, the state and industry, in terms of our student work, as well as in terms of getting onto both national, local, regional bodies in our country, we are then contributing to how we craft new ideas about things like crime and violence, climate change, budgeting, and so forth. And so we have a number of projects over the year that, since we last spoke, that we have embarked on to deal with flooding, to deal with hurricanes, to deal with livelihood matters, and also to deal with life matters. One of them that remains most profound, again, is violence against women, particularly sexual violence, and how we confront that as a society. And I must say that our postgraduate students, along with our undergraduate students, in spite of all the COVID-19 challenges, have taken up the mandate to move from the face-to-face offline environment to the online to confront similar things through their webinars, through their virtual back talk, through their Instagram work, to try to promote what they were advocating in December 2020, youth perspectives that the nation tends to either pay lip service or to brush to the wayside. And ultimately, the aim is to address these disparities and inequities that keep reemerging. So that said, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conversation. And I will reassert my starting position. Where the discourse misinterprets, misrepresents, misdirects the facts, the realities of our social and political lives, we must ensure that we have a seat at the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue-Ann. Hoping you feel better really soon. Yes. Paulina, did you want to summarize any of that up?
Bueno, les puedo decir que creo que la presentación de Sue-Ann se entabla muy bien con lo que va a decir Julia. Uno de los puntos más importantes que dijo Sue-Ann es que las feministas tenemos que tener presencia o un lugar en la mesa, sobre todo como personas comprometidas con movimientos sociales y justicia social y activismo, porque es nuestra responsabilidad que cuando el discurso oficial muchas veces no representa o de hecho trata de representar de una manera diferente nuestras realidades políticas y sociales, pues tenemos la responsabilidad de hecho de cambiar esa percepción y además tenemos que expandir la forma en la que entendemos estas crisis que en realidad son interseccionales y por lo tanto tenemos un mandato estratégico de estar ahí y asegurarnos de que ¿cómo se dice? Nuestro compromiso con el género y la igualdad y la justicia estén representados. Sorry, someone always decides to call it the worst possible moment.
Oh, thanks, Paulina, so much. Okay, so then why don't we go ahead and introduce Paulina, back to you again, our 2020 from Mexico, which is Julia.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Julia Escalante de Haro, who's a feminist, activist, and lawyer who studied at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And she has a lot of experience in the field of sexual and reproductive rights, especially in relation to abortion. And she has also played roles in the political sphere, but also primarily in civil society organizations. And she's been part of important global and regional initiatives to push forward women's and human rights. For example, in the UN, but also the Organization of American States. And she's currently the regional coordinator for the CLADEM, which is the largest transnational feminist network in Latin America, the Latin American Caribbean Committee for the Defense of Women's Rights. And I'm going to share this presentation, so just give me a second to share, set up. I can share, right? Yes, I can. Okay.
Muchas gracias, Paulina.
Can everybody see?
Yes. Muchas gracias a Paulina por la invitación. Muchas gracias también a la sociedad por esta amable invitación que no pudimos concretar en enero del año pasado. Me siento sumamente honrada de estar con ustedes esta tarde.
So Julia thanks you for the invitation to SWS to be a global partner, and she feels very honored to be here among us, especially since last year we couldn't meet each other in person.
Yo les quisiera compartir un poco de lo que desde el CLADEM, que es una red regional con presencia en 15 países, tenemos en la mira particularmente respecto de la situación de la violencia contra las mujeres en la región de Latinoamérica y el Caribe.
So what Julia wants to do in the presentation is share with all of us what CLADEM, which is, like I had said, a regional network, and it has presence in 15 countries, what it's doing or what it's concerned with respect to violence against women in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Y un poco en el sentido, si me ayudas con la siguiente, Pau, de lo que comentaba Suan, este contexto en el que nos encontramos ya en la pandemia extendida, ¿no? Hemos estado hablando de la post-pandemia, pero parece que en nuestros países todavía no llegamos a ese momento y enfrentamos un contexto particularmente crudo y duro para las mujeres.
So Julia is talking about this context, which Suan in many ways already referenced, in which we find ourselves in currently. Many have started to talk about the post-pandemic world. However, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean do not find themselves there, and it is in fact a very raw and rough context for women and girls.
Recientemente han sido publicados los datos de seguridad en México, y seguramente estarán publicándose en muchos países, y el contexto que aparece en la diapositiva no es nada distinto. Por el contrario, el 2020 significó para las mujeres un recrudecimiento de la tasa de feminicidios en un país que ya venía con números altísimos de feminicidios.
So what you can see in the slide reflects really this context, and also the fact that, for example, in Mexico, there has been a recent publication on the safety and security data. It's likely that countries in the region reflect the same trends, namely that 2020 really saw a retrenchment of violence against women, as well as the murder of women, a concept that we use in Mexico is feminicide or feminicidio, which goes beyond the killing of women because they're women, but also points to the complicity of the state in tolerating that violence and its impunity.
Me hallo con la siguiente, Pau. Y el feminicidio no es más que la punta del iceberg de las violencias que vivimos las mujeres, las niñas y las adolescentes en la región. Es solamente una muestra de cómo la pandemia ha venido a recrudecer ya la situación o las situaciones por las que atravesamos las mujeres, entre ellas la situación o la condición migratoria, que para el Triángulo Norte de Latinoamérica es una tragedia humanitaria nunca antes vista.
So feminicide or feminicidio really represents the top of the iceberg, really, of the different kinds or forms of violences that girls, adolescents, and women in the region experience. The pandemic is really a retrenchment or reflects a retrenchment of the different situations or conditions that have shaped women's experiences of violence. For example, being a migrant, Julia referenced the triangle in North America of migration, meaning primarily like Mexico and also Central America towards the US. That is really a tragedy because it has seen so much violence.
Y en este contexto, la debilidad democrática y la limitada respuesta que nuestros gobiernos han dado a la pandemia evade su responsabilidad de brindar una respuesta efectiva, articulada y eficiente frente a los casos de violencia basada en el género.
And we see also, we're witnessing here democratic weakening, or the weakening of democracies that have actually resulted in a limited response to the pandemic, in turn allowing governments to elude their responsibility to bring forward an effective, well-articulated, and efficient response to gender-based violence.
¿Me pasas dos más, Pau? La otra. No, la anterior. En esta gráfica es solamente para mostrar un esfuerzo de fotografiar el avance de los países de Latinoamérica y el Caribe en la implementación de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenibles. Las marcas que están más rosas o más rojas es donde está peor calificado ese país, mientras que las que están en azul o verde son mejor calificados. Varias de las agencias de Naciones Unidas han manifestado que la pandemia nos va a hacer retroceder casi 10 años en el desarrollo y garantía de derechos para alcanzar estos objetivos, ¿no? Y eso impacta directamente en la vida de las mujeres.
So what this graph shows, I hope that you can all see, are the efforts to kind of provide a picture of the advancement or progress in sustainable development in Latin American and Caribbean countries. What is pink or red are like the worst graded countries, and the blue or green represent the better graded countries. And what UN agencies have said recently about the pandemic is that it will really make these countries go backwards even 10 years in terms of the achievements that they had already been able to gain, but also what they hadn't, so that it really has a lot of negative implications for women if these sustainable development goals cannot be achieved, or the ability to do so goes back or regresses 10 years.
¿Me pasas la otra?
Uh-huh.
Y decir, bueno, muy rápidamente que en este contexto, ¿no? Todavía de pandemia, además los derechos de las mujeres se convierten en un espacio de permanente disputa. Si bien en los primeros 10 años de la década alcanzamos un avance en reconocimiento de derechos, en esta pasada década lo que hemos enfrentado el movimiento feminista es un periodo de resistencia y de enfrentamiento contra los grupos más conservadores. ¿Me pasas la siguiente mientras?
So I'll translate in the meantime. So the context of the pandemic is one in which women's rights are constantly ongoing contested terrain, even if perhaps in the first decade of the 2000s we saw a lot of progress in terms of women's rights. Last decade, the feminist movement in the region really faced a lot of backlash and resistance from conservative groups.
¿Me pones la siguiente, Pau? Y es justo en esta década que estamos las mujeres enfrentando una serie de embestidas de los grupos más conservadores que se han venido afianzando en toda la región con muchísimos recursos, con estrategias diferenciadas, con presencia en congresos, con presencia en la toma de decisiones de políticas públicas, amenazando derechos que particularmente impactan con la niñez, la adolescencia, la diversidad sexual, la educación.
So what we see here is that in this decade, feminists and women have been really having to face attacks on the part of conservative forces in the region. And what you see represented here is an attempt to show that, and namely conservative groups that have become embedded in different parts of society with a lot of resources, but also different strategies in order to be part of, for example, congresses, legislatures, but also decision-making processes in terms of public policies that threaten all the rights related to children, adolescents, women, and also sexual diversity.
Me pasas la siguiente. Y este avance de grupos antiderechos que atentan contra estos derechos ganados en la primera década, también se insertan en un momento especial de nuestra región, donde las economías neoliberales han generado mayor desigualdad. Si me pasas la siguiente. Y déficit democrático, con profundas crisis en muchos países de la región ante fraudes electorales y con un dogmatismo religioso que profundiza el individualismo y que ya no está sustentado solo en la religión predominante en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, sino diversificado en distintas iglesias. Mientras me pasas la que sigue.
So, okay, so these anti-right groups, what they're doing is that they're inserting themselves into the region at a very particular moment in time. We have the aftermath of the effects of neoliberal economies that have widened the gaps in inequalities. And also fostered a democratic deficit as part of that. But in addition, we also have a resurgence of religious dogmatism that in fact is no longer even represented in the dominant religions of the region, namely like Catholicism, for example, but actually in many different other churches. So it's really has permeated society.
Y la que sigue para ya irme al final. Y en este, si bien tenemos todos estos desafíos, tenemos también oportunidades que ha brindado las alianzas estratégicas entre los feminismos de la región, el sumar esfuerzos con la agenda de la diversidad sexual para denunciar la homo, trans, lesbofobia, fortalecer también los movimientos ambientalistas desde la perspectiva de género, fortalecer también esta articulación sur-sur que nos ha permitido también generar sinergias, ¿no? en distintos países, aprovechar lo que llamamos la marea que viene desde el cono sur y que ha popularizado el feminismo y que lo ha hecho ser un movimiento masivo y con una base social juvenil muy amplia. Valorar también lo que hemos conseguido, que ha sido mucho, y contrarrestar de manera más articulada estos argumentos antiderechos que además se vienen construyendo también desde la pseudoacademia.
Sorry, one second. So despite these challenges, we see in this context also opportunities, in particular strategic alliances between the different feminisms in the region, in addition to joining efforts with groups committed to sexual diversity to denounce trans, homo, lesbophobia, and efforts to support environmental movements from a gender perspective. South-South synergies have been also really important. And here it's also important to mention the green tide. Well, that's how it has been usually known in Latin America, but the tide of feminism that comes from the southern cone of Latin America currently that has really popularized feminism, really creating massive support among youth and adolescents. So that is something that needs to be valued. It's part of the accomplishments, and one of the opportunities to value really what has been accomplished, which is a lot. Also, in order to better articulate efforts to face the attacks by religious and conservative forces, and even those that come from the pseudo academy.
Thank you. Si quieres poner la última. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I'll stop sharing.
Paulina.
Gracias, Julia.
Gracias, gracias, Pau. Gracias a todas.
Just one quick point of clarification from Oslam in the chat before we move on to Liz. Oslam just wanted some clarification. It was on when the graphic of the Oslam, go ahead if you want to, since you popped in. Yeah.
The caballo de Troy, the Trojan horse. I just wondered where it was. I mean, what organization was it? Just a men's rights group, or victimized fathers group, governmental? What was it that was disseminating it?
Es un grupo antiderechos, un grupo, son grupos conservadores que han utilizado esa forma de difundir lo que ellos llaman ideología de género como algo contrario a las familias, contrario a las tradiciones, contrario a los derechos según su perspectiva.
So this image is from a conservative anti-rights group that has developed this discourse of the ideology of gender that seeks to really attack women's rights and also sexual diversity, sexual and reproductive rights. So it's really trying to posit feminist discourses on gender and gender equality as dangerous to society, especially also through appeals to family, for example. So but I don't know that there's like a specific name of an organization, but it is an anti-rights group.
That is actually what I was trying to get at, because this is very, I mean, I can ask toward the end. Actually, I can't ask toward the end because I have to teach, but like in Poland, there is a very similar thing. And in Turkey, there's also a very similar thing. And in Poland, this would be like the Ordo Iuris. And I was wondering what the equivalent in Mexico would be. If there is one. If there is one organized to that scale where they actually are actively pursuing partnerships with, men's rights groups in Chile or Colombia or wherever else.
So let me just, I don't know, Julia might be the expert here. Julia, si no sé si sabes si existe un activismo bien organizado de hombres que buscan esto. Ella mencionó que en Turquía y en Polonia existen estos grupos. Creo que mencionó un grupo. You said it was Uri Irdis.
Ordo
que es una organización de hombres que están también haciendo este tipo de materiales y también promocionan ese mismo discurso. Entonces ella quería saber qué también están organizados en México y si existen organizaciones específicas que hacen esto.
Sí, el movimiento Con mis hijos no te metas es un movimiento que viene de Estados Unidos, pero se ha expandido en toda Latinoamérica. Y es un movimiento liderado por hombres, aunque con participación mixta.
So she's pointing you to the movement Don't Mess With My Children, Con mis hijos no te metas, which even though it started in the United States, it really did diffuse to Latin America, and it is a male-led. There's like the leadership is male, but there's mixed participation as well.
Gracias.
Gracias, Osle.
Okay. I'm glad that we could get your question in, Özlem, before you have to leave. Yeah, and that goes for anybody. If you have any questions and you can't stay till the end, or even something for Sue-Ann earlier, you can put that in the chat and then we can follow up with you later. Okay, so we're back to Paulina again, who so graciously has stepped in for our SWS member, Pamela, to introduce our 2018 partner from Peru, which is Liz. And so unfortunately, Pamela could not be with us today, but has left us in good hands with Paulina. So take it away.
Well, thank you. And it is really an honor also to introduce Liz again, to be here with us, among us. So Liz is a feminist sociologist, and she's also a specialist in gender-based violence, and she is the director of the Centro de la Mujer Peruana, Flora Tristan, or the Women's Center, Peruvian Women's Center, Flora Tristan. So Liz, adelante. Si quieres compartir tu pantalla y yo voy traduciéndote.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you, everybody. I prefer speaking my language, Spanish, because my English is not good. So, let me a minute, please. I lose my presentation. Bueno, ¿me escuchan? Sí, perfecto. Yo estaba revisando la presentación que hice en Atlanta cuando tuve la oportunidad de poder estar con ustedes en persona y quise colocar muchas partes de esta presentación y tratar de vincularla al contexto que actualmente vivimos y presentar a la vez nuevamente a mi institución, que es Flora Tristan.
So what Liz did is she looked back at the presentation that she shared with us back in 2018. And what she's going to try to do in this presentation is really bring that part into today's context, and in so doing continue to represent her organization, Peruvian Women's Center, Flora Tristan.
Las fotografías que están ahí, Flora Tristan fue fundada en 1979. A la fecha tenemos 41 años de existencia. Es una de las organizaciones feministas más antiguas del país y de la región. Y las fotos que están ahí grafican parte de esta historia, ¿no? Y las activistas que empezaron la institución por la década, terminando la década del 70, desde los activismos que han continuado con la foto a colores que ven al fondo, y el nuevo contexto que tenemos que vivir actualmente y cómo lo estamos enfrentando en la distancia, pero juntas lo representa la foto de Flora con la mascarilla.
So these pictures represent the new context that we're facing, but also the history of the organization. Flora Tristan was founded in 1979, so it is 41 years old, which makes it one of the oldest feminist organizations in the country, but also in the region. And what you can see In the black and white picture is the activist at the end of the decade of the 70s that created this organization, and the picture in color really shows you the continuance of that activism into the present, although the new context that we are all having to face, even if we are apart, we are together in it, is represented by Flora Tristan with the face mask.
Bueno, Flora Tristán fue fundada en la década del 70 y pertenece justamente al conjunto de feministas que en esa época se indignan por las desigualdades y que empiezan a construir un movimiento en la región. Pero la característica de Flora Tristán es que siempre surgió muy vinculado al movimiento feminista peruano, pero muy vinculado a la defensa de la democracia y a la defensa de las dictaduras que se estaban viviendo en ese momento en la región y que continuaron por varios años en el país.
So the feminists that were the founders of the Flora Tristan organization were part of the broader feminist movement in Peru who were outraged at gender inequality, but also they were really linked to the movements in the defense of democracy in a context of dictatorships around the region.
Estas ideas de defensa de la democracia, pensando en la democracia como el principal escenario o el ideal escenario para la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres, continúa hasta la fecha con diferentes episodios en los que incluso hasta hace pocos meses hemos tenido que defender la democracia en nuestro país. Acá, por ejemplo, pongo algunas fotos que forman parte de la historia de Flora Tristán y que representan cómo las lideresas que fundaron la institución se enfrentaron al terrorismo durante 2 décadas, y cómo hasta el día de hoy seguimos tratando de recuperar esa memoria, de recuperar también la defensa del acceso a la justicia de las víctimas del conflicto armado interno.
Liz, la última cosa, ya no te, lo último no te escuché, perdón, después de recuperar la memoria y la defensa.
Del acceso a la justicia de las víctimas del conflicto armado interno.
Ah, perfecto. Gracias. All right, so these are pictures that continue to represent the history of Flora Tristan. And they reflect also the belief that democracy constitutes the best scenario for women's rights. However, the defense of democracy is not a thing of the past. It is something that has been ongoing for them. So these pictures show the leaders of Flora Tristan, in fact, facing terror and terrorism during 2 decades of political repression. And what they want to do here is to recover the memory of this defense of democracy and a fight for accessing justice for the victims of terror and internal armed conflict. Apologies for my cat.
Gracias, Paulina. Sigue siendo un reto para Flora Tristán tener esta perspectiva de defensa de la democracia, de oponernos al uso de la fuerza, pero también de un abordaje interseccional de los problemas. Por lo que la perspectiva de Flora Tristán tiene que ver con la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres, diferenciando dentro de las mujeres las desigualdades que también existen entre nosotras mismas y apostando por una mirada interseccional de los problemas.
So it has been a challenge for Flora Tristan to have this perspective of being committedly opposed to the use of force, but also that they have done this from an intersectional perspective. Namely, they are always aware of the need to defend women's rights, but at the same time recognize the differences among women, and also to have an intersectional approach to problems.
Hasta el día de hoy, como pueden ver en estas láminas, tenemos los eslogans de lo que es malo para la democracia, es malo también para las mujeres. Y también Flora Tristan se articula a nivel nacional a un espacio de feministas que se llama Feministas por la Democracia y que tiene que ver justamente con la defensa de estos principios, pero también con hacer frente a las desigualdades desde una mirada interseccional. Así, Flora Tristan pertenece al movimiento feminista y responde al movimiento feminista. Nuestras ideas, nuestro ideario, nuestros principios se vinculan netamente con fortalecer, en primer lugar, el movimiento feminista como actor social para garantizar la democracia en nuestros países.
So what these slides are showing you are some of the slogans that reflect the idea that what is bad for democracy is also bad for women. So what Flora Tristan has done is to really integrate or articulate itself in a network of feminists for democracy, for the defense of democratic principles, but again, from an intersectional perspective. So ultimately, the goal is to push forward a feminist movement to strengthen democracy and these principles.
Bueno, ahí comparto algunas otras figuras, digamos, o fotografías del inicio de Flora Tristan. Y aquí algunas otras de movilizaciones más recientes, tratando de hacer un paralelo entre la historia anterior y la actual, ¿no? Yo creo que es muy importante tener en cuenta que la nueva generación que estamos en Flora Tristan, pisamos sobre las huellas previas y seguimos un camino abierto hace muchos años por quienes nos precedieron.
So what the pictures reflect is really both the new and, the old and the new forms of mobilizations, and there's a clear parallel between them. But what is very clear to Liz is that the new generation of feminist activists who are part of Flora Tristan is that they are following the footsteps of those who went before them, and also that they're walking a path that was opened for them before.
Voy a ir adelantando algunas páginas porque creo que el tiempo me va a escasear. Y quería comentarles qué cosa hace Flora Tristan hoy en día. Flora Tristan cuenta con 4 áreas de intervención. Una que está orientada a la defensa de los derechos humanos de las mujeres, en donde tenemos un servicio de atención a la violencia, trabajando asesorando, atendiendo a sobrevivientes de violencia, y también trabajando con mujeres indígenas amazónicas.
So she just skipped a couple of slides for the sake of time, but what she wanted to highlight is what Flora Tristan does today. And there are 4 areas of intervention, and one of them that she wanted to highlight was on women's human rights. And in that area, they work with survivors of violence, but also with indigenous women from the Amazon.
Tenemos una segunda área de trabajo, que es el área de participación política, desde donde promovemos la participación política de las mujeres con paridad y sin acoso, y recientemente uno de los principales logros en este campo es que hemos logrado la paridad, que se apruebe la paridad en el país. Hemos sido parte de quienes la hemos impulsado desde hace muchos años.
The second area, so the second area is political participation. The organization is committed to fostering women's political participation, but also achieving parity, which in fact they did, but also political participation without harassment.
Otra de nuestras áreas es el área de derechos sexuales y derechos reproductivos, vinculada justamente con la defensa del derecho a decidir de las mujeres, actualmente promoviendo que se despenalice el aborto. El aborto en el país está penalizado en la gran mayoría de causales, y promoviendo también la marea verde, que viene, digamos, a impulsar un gran cambio en la región por el derecho a decidir de las mujeres. Y ahí quería, perdón, ahí Julia, digamos, Paulina.
All right. So the next area is sexual and reproductive rights, which is very much linked to defending and promoting women's rights to choose and to the decriminalization of abortion. And here they're also writing the momentum of the green tide, which, as I had mentioned before, is coming from the Southern Cone, from Argentina, for example, Chile. And they have really pushed for change with regards to access of women's rights to choose, especially because in Peru, abortion is criminalized for most reasons.
Actualmente estamos en una lucha por muchos años para que se despenalice el aborto en casos de violación sexual. Decía, como comentaba Julia, tenemos un momento actual en donde hay una base social de muchas jóvenes que facilitan, digamos, que el debate, el tema sigue en el debate de la agenda pública y la agenda política, y creemos que es un buen momento para seguir promoviendo, bueno, siempre va a ser un buen momento para promover los derechos sexuales y reproductivos de las mujeres, pero es un buen momento para exigir la legalización del aborto o mínimamente la despenalización por causales.
So for many years, they have been involved in this battle for the decriminalization of abortion. And like Julia had mentioned earlier, the current moment of this green tide has really created a platform for this issue to be very much part of the political agenda. So in a sense, it's a good moment, although she says that it's always a good moment to defend women's rights to choose. It is really a good moment right now to demand, if not the legalization of abortion, to actually decriminalize the reasons for which women are then prosecuted if they abort.
Trabajamos con jóvenes, trabajamos con liderazgos desde las escuelas para promover justamente una mayor vinculación con sus derechos sexuales, sus derechos reproductivos, con que se promueva desde muy jóvenes el derecho a decidir sobre tu propio cuerpo, que es una de las estrategias que para Flora Tristán creemos que tiene mayor sostenibilidad. El trabajo desde la adolescencia, el trabajo con mujeres muy, muy jóvenes, crea una potencia increíble. Y hoy las lideresas que hemos formado desde el colegio, estamos seguras que van a tener un rol importantísimo en los próximos años, no solamente en la política, sino en diversos espacios. Y siempre privilegiamos la formación de liderazgos adolescentes y jóvenes de las zonas de menores recursos, teniendo en consideración que son estos lugares tienen menores oportunidades y sin embargo mucha potencia frente a la indignación que tiene que ser canalizada.
So she wants to emphasize here the work that they do primarily with youth. They're really engaged in creating or promoting youth leadership, especially by teaching them about their sexual and reproductive rights, that they have a right to choose over their own bodies, and that for them, this is really a sustainable goal if they start working with youth from a very young age. It creates enormous potential. So she's convinced that the new leaders that they have formed by working with them from a very young age, these new leaders will really play a very important role in changing things in the years to come, and not only in political spaces, but also in different spaces. But always they're also emphasizing the need to work with youth from marginalized areas or areas of low resources, because this is a way to channel their outrage at the oppression that they may face.
Y la cuarta área de intervención de Flora Tristán es desarrollo rural, que es un área de trabajo con mujeres agricultoras en regiones rurales de nuestro país, trabajando alrededor del vínculo entre el cambio climático y las desigualdades de género, promoviendo mayores capacidades para que las mujeres puedan hacer frente al cambio climático, para que se conviertan en productoras agroecológicas y para que por medio de mejorar sus medios de vida y producción se empoderen, logren autonomía económica, pero también una actitud diferente frente a las autoridades, es decir, promover también participación de las mujeres rurales en los espacios de decisión.
And this other area is on rural development. They work with women in the agricultural sector, especially as they have to face the intersection of climate change and gender inequality. What they want to do is create opportunities for women to face climate change as they become agricultural producers in an empowered manner, where they can also achieve economic autonomy and also be part of decision-making processes.
Bueno, en resumen, voy a ir resumiendo porque yo sé que con la traducción se lleva el doble de tiempo. Pero bueno, nuestras estrategias son estas que están acá. Our strategies is in the picture. La incidencia, formación, fortalecimiento del movimiento feminista ante todo, producción de conocimiento y reflexión feminista permanente.
Did you freeze?
Yes, yes.
Did you finish? Ah, ok. Es que perdón, es que como que se congela también mi internet y no sé si habías terminado o te congelaste.
Ay, perdón.
Perdón. So she wants and these are strategies that they're pursuing from incidencia, which means like ongoing kind of like activism and lobbying, but also training and strengthening organizations, and really, yes, promoting activism, as well as the creation of feminist knowledge and promoting feminist debate.
Trabajamos también en articulación con otras redes feministas. Bueno, nosotros somos una organización, no una red, por ejemplo, con CLADEM, con la articulación feminista Mercosur y con otras redes nacionales y regionales. Pero quería mencionar algo que es muy importante y que también lo mencionó Julia, que tiene que ver con cómo nos enfrentamos en la región a esta avanzada de los fundamentalismos, con expresiones de la campaña Con mis hijos no te metas, que es una estrategia regional, que también la padecimos y la padecemos en el país, y que directamente ataca el ejercicio de los derechos sexuales y reproductivos, la democracia y el ejercicio de los derechos de la población LGBTI.
Mm-hmm. So, and part of the way in which Flora Tristan works is through collaboration with other networks, for example, as being part of the CLADEM, or also Mercosur, so they're part of both national and regional networks. And like Julia had mentioned previously, this context of new fundamentalisms has really been something that they've had to deal with in Peru, because it has mounted an attack on both sexual and reproductive rights, but also democracy.
Y finalmente, ¿cómo estamos haciendo frente a la pandemia? En resumen, es un contexto muy difícil, es un contexto desafiante para todo el mundo, pero que efectivamente, como ya lo mencionaron anteriormente, ha profundizado las desigualdades. Y en un país tan desigual, la pandemia no está golpeando de igual manera. Es más, ahora mismo, con la segunda ola, que en el caso de Perú, como entiendo que también en otros lugares parece un maremoto, nos está desangrando, y hay una situación muy complicada ahora mismo que vinculado también a las crisis políticas, profundizan la pobreza, la incertidumbre, y por supuesto en un contexto en donde nos es mucho más difícil poder articular como movimiento social.
And of course, she wants to mention that the pandemic context has been really hard for Flora Tristan to face. Currently, the second wave that is happening in Peru, as in other countries, has been akin to an earthquake. It is bleeding Peruvian society, deepening poverty and other inequalities, as well as other forms of crises. And it has really made it challenging to articulate themselves as a social movement.
En este momento, para resumir, solo quiero decir que la violencia en todo este tiempo evidentemente se profundizó la violencia sexual, las mujeres desaparecidas, que es una problemática que viene incrementándose en el día a día, se incrementó la crueldad hacia las mujeres, y lamentablemente la respuesta del Estado todavía no logra ocupar una dimensión de género adecuada. El día de ayer nuevamente nos decretaron el confinamiento absoluto, tal cual estuviéramos al inicio de toda esta tragedia, por lo cual vuelve a la preocupación lo que ya veníamos levantando durante mucho tiempo, que es el incremento de la violencia y la precariedad de las mujeres, la doble o hasta triple jornada que ya estamos viviendo y que se profundizará, por lo que actualmente, hoy mismo, estamos como movimiento, como organización, emitiendo una serie de pronunciamientos y tratando de incidir frente a las autoridades para lograr que las medidas tengan en cuenta a las mujeres y la situación dramática que vivimos no profundice las desigualdades preexistentes.
So just to wrap up, she wants to emphasize that the pandemic context, as Julia had also mentioned, has deepened or made worse violence, especially sexual violence, but also a problem of disappearances of women and girls. It has really increased, and the state response to these crises has not taken a gender perspective. As of yesterday, she said that there's been a new absolute lockdown that was started in Peru, just kind of like as it was the beginning of the pandemic. And as such, they have concerns about how this will once more lead to the increase of violence against women and girls, given the precarity of many women, including, for example, their participation in a double or even triple shift, and the deepening of other forms of inequality. So as a movement, they are trying to make sure, or they're trying to demand that the government takes this into consideration as they develop measures to face the pandemic.
Ok, muchas gracias y solo decirles que estaremos como feministas vigilantes de este contexto y por supuesto con mucha sororidad con otras mujeres.
Thank you.
Gracias, Liz. Paulina, do you want to translate that last bit for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
She said thank you again, and she just wants to say that they will be, as feminists, looking over everything that happens, even from a distance in the Southern Cone. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you all for your kind words in the chat, to all of our global feminist partners, to the SWS liaisons. And as I mentioned, even in Oslam's chat, if you yourself have a connection to a global feminist organization, this is the space to do it. And please come to our international committee meeting, our business meeting on February 26th. We have a new subcommittee chair, Rita, who's on here, who's replacing the long years of service from Younglin regarding this subcommittee. And we have a lot of exciting new directions and expanded ways that we can continue this partnership. So we have a little less than 15 minutes, so feel free if you have questions to raise your hand, put them in the chat if you're more shy. And let's see what we have for Julia and Liz. It could be comments as well, you know.
I wanted to say something. Yeah,
Sure,
Josephine, yes, right. I'd like to thank Liz and Julia, Sue-Ann, and definitely Paulina. You did a good job there for the presentations and the updates and the new initiatives that these organizations are doing. I know, you know, there's certain commonalities in all of them in terms of, for example, building strategic alliances through mobilizations with other organizations, or bringing the feminist voice to other debates, mainstreaming that into debates like about, for example, climate change, reproductive rights, you know, gender-based violence seem to be something that all of them were talking about. And you know, just their commitment to having a voice in wider conversations. They all seem to be talking about that. And Liz at the end brought that in, but I was just wondering how the pandemic had affected the work of these organizations in terms of reaching out and making the kind of changes they want to see happen. How has the pandemic affected them? And how have they used the work of their own organizations, their own strategic forms of engagement to bring up, to reach out to women? For example, women experiencing gender-based violence, it's increased during the pandemic. How have they tried to address these issues, whether through advocacy, activism, on influencing policy changes, or just going out there and doing something? You know, how I'd like to learn a little bit more about the pandemic and its impact on the work of their organizations.
No sé si quieren que les traduzca. La pregunta es básicamente que,
No.
bueno, primero ella comenzó por decir,
Perdón.
bueno, ¿quieres responder? Nada más era cómo ha impactado la pandemia el trabajo de sus organizaciones y cómo han respuesto a las experiencias de las mujeres.
Liz, ¿tú quieres comenzar?
Sí, sí, está bien. Sí, bueno, ha habido una afectación muy grande. Primero, hemos tenido que reinventar nuestro trabajo de forma intempestiva. En el caso de Flora Tristán, no estábamos preparadas para el teletrabajo y es muy difícil acomodar un trabajo que está acostumbrado y que está hecho para hacer cara a cara, para el intercambio, para el acompañamiento de forma virtual. Eso ha tenido como consecuencia que hayamos tenido pues que pensar mucho cómo llegar a las mujeres. Y como primera medida, lo que nosotras hicimos es preocuparnos por la población con la que trabajábamos, porque la preocupación principal estaba en en la sobrevivencia, concretamente en tener que comer, ¿no? Y 2, en la atención en salud. Por lo que el primer paso que dimos fue tomar contacto con las mujeres con las que con las que desarrollamos nuestro trabajo y saber cómo estaban para ver de qué manera se pueden tejer redes de apoyo para la contención de la tragedia.
So, the pandemic really affected deeply the work of their organization. They had to reinvent the way in which they did work very quickly because they were not prepared for virtual or remote work, especially because of the work that they do is very much face-to-face, especially in accompanying survivors or dealing with other issues. It's always been face-to-face. So here, they had to really rethink how it is that they were reaching out to women. First and foremost, they were really worried about the women that they have worked with, issues of even basic survival, like do they have enough to eat, for example. So what they started to do from the start was to reach out with the women with whom they have always worked, and see in which ways they could start building again networks of support that could contain the tragedy of the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you.
Entre las estrategias que hemos tomado han sido, 1, la toma de contacto con la población, 2, el facilitar elementos de protección, es decir, mascarillas, alcohol, porque muchas personas no tuvieron acceso en un primer momento a estos artículos básicos en el momento actual, y también la información, porque hay mucha desinformación y mucho temor y mucha desinformación que el Estado no lograba revertir. Y algunas actividades, con el pasar de los meses, sobre todo en áreas rurales y en espacios abiertos, hemos logrado retomar algunas actividades de forma presencial, ¿no? Reduciendo el número de personas. Si los talleres que teníamos que hacer eran para 30 personas, esta vez eran para 5, y tenías que hacer muchos más talleres en espacios abiertos y con un protocolo que desde el mes de abril nosotras implementamos en las actividades de la institución. Otra medida que nosotras tomamos fue, formamos una cadena de solidaridad, que lo llamamos bono feminista, ¿no? Que es a través de donaciones de personas, amigas, de diferentes personas, logramos dar una cantidad de dinero específico, 300 soles, que vienen a ser como $90 más o menos, para las mujeres que estaban en situación de precariedad debido a la pandemia. Tanto para quienes no les llegaban los bonos del Estado y estaban con COVID o no tenían que comer, o se enfrentaban a una defunción, al fallecimiento de algún familiar y había que hasta ayudar a poder ver temas de los entierros. Es decir, se formó una cadena de solidaridad feminista para lograr ayudar a mujeres de forma concreta. La verdad que con dinero concreto para compra de alimentos, ¿no? Que fue lo principal en ese momento. y que todavía se encuentra activo, pero que en este momento no sabemos con esta nueva ola cómo se va a realizar con las nuevas políticas de confinamiento.
Gracias, Liz. So yes, she just wanted to let you know some of the strategies that she's pursued, like facilitating access to personal protective equipment and trying to provide information to the population to counter misinformation. And in rural spaces that are more open, they've been able to hold workshops, even if with a decreased number of people. But first and foremost, another strategy that they pursued was that of a solidarity chain called Feminist Bonus, which was able to collect money for donations that would allow women to actually buy food if they didn't have any access to help from the state. But also, for example, if they were sick with COVID and couldn't work, or also for burials. So it's really been about very concrete ways of helping. This is still an active effort, but they don't know how the second wave will affect these efforts as well.
Y otra estrategia que hemos desarrollado es difundir información en los idiomas nativos. Nosotras trabajamos en zonas amazónicas y eso fue fundamental para que la información sobre la pandemia y sobre las rutas para la atención en violencia particularmente llegue a las mujeres que no hablan castellano, porque fue el principal idioma en el que difundió información el Estado y era necesario que las poblaciones amazónicas y quechohablantes tengan información de lo que estaba sucediendo.
Mm-hmm. So just the last thing is that they did a lot of work to provide information in indigenous languages because they work with indigenous women, especially when it came to accessing information, having support if they're facing violence.
A mí solo me gustaría agregar en el caso de CLADEM, que somos una red, la experiencia de las organizaciones nacionales como Flora y muchas otras en la región, que efectivamente se tuvieron que construir con mucha creatividad estrategias y acciones, no solo para cumplir con los compromisos adquiridos, sino para llegar a las mujeres que estaban en condiciones de riesgo, ver cómo el Estado fracasaba en su obligación de proteger, obligó a generar un sinfín de directorios, stickers en WhatsApp, grupos en Telegram, cosas rudimentarias como colocar un cartel afuera de tu casa ofreciendo alojamiento. Muchas compañeras en México, particularmente con las trabajadoras sexuales, que fueron uno de los grupos que fue muy golpeado por la contingencia, cómo se crearon comedores comunitarios en los barrios. Es decir, efectivamente ha sido un impacto muy sensible al accionar de las organizaciones, pero al tiempo ha generado mucho aprendizaje, muchas lecciones y nos ha dejado también la enseñanza de que podemos ser creativas y de que podemos unidas también, porque es un esfuerzo no de una persona, no de una organización, sino de las mujeres en lo espontáneo, en dar la respuesta muy, muy positiva.
Mm-hmm. So Julia just really wants to add that from the CLADEM's perspective, well, they're made of different organizations, and like Elise said, national organizations in the region were really affected by COVID. So what the focus of these national organizations was to really build with lots of creativities, ways of or strategies or actions, not only to fulfill the commitments that they already had with women, but also out at risk or in situations of risk, especially as they were witnessing the failed response of the state to the pandemic and for these women. And here they had to be really creative, for example, creating stickers on WhatsApp or Telegram groups, or even just hanging a poster in front of people's houses offering shelter or other kinds of resources. They also work with sex workers who were very much affected by the pandemic and the lockdown. They build communal eateries, so really strategies from the ground up. But at the same time, they have gained a lot of valuable lessons, and they have learned that they can be creative. But these are efforts that are not just from one person. They come from women and feminists being united and joined in their efforts to really help others.
I just wanted to add, I know we're running out of time, but there were some commonalities, you know, that Josephine, you mentioned, but for many of the domestic violence organizations in the US during the pandemic, this has been one of the issues around food insecurity, right? Information dissemination, that violence happening at the home. At the same time, how are these non-governmental organizations connecting together and mobilizing to try and address what is happening to women in the home during the pandemic and the violence experience, and in the context of immigration, and how food insecurity intersects. So it was really great to hear this kind of contextual globalization, where some of the issues that you speak really fit in within rather the global global aspects, but also have the specific historical context which you shared with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So unfortunately, as Maggie said, we are out of time. I know. Much appreciation though to all of you for being here, for spending your afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are together with one another. And we will continue these conversations, as you know, through the International Committee all the time. And so please stay tuned for more work from us, more work from the Global Feminist Partners. And thank you all again. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Bye-bye.
Bye.